the slap that shattered a badge. The sound came first, not the slap itself, though that crack echoed down Lenox Avenue like a gunshot, but the silence that followed. A silence so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to drain the color from the summer afternoon. The street vendors stopped calling. The dice game on the corner froze mid-roll. Even the jazz spilling from the open door of Small's Paradise seemed to dim, as if the music itself understood that something irreversible had just occurred. It was a Tuesday in July of 1934. Harlem at 3 in the afternoon, alive with the particular rhythm that belonged to that neighborhood alone. That blend of Southern grace and Northern grit, church hymns and numbers runners, Sunday dresses and Saturday night swagger. The kind of afternoon where grandmothers sat on stoops fanning themselves with funeral home advertisements, where children played stickball in the streets, where the heat rose in waves off the pavement and made everything shimmer like a mirage. She had been walking home from Greater Bethel AME Church. A woman in her 60s, dressed with the dignity that her generation wore like armor. Dark dress despite the heat, white gloves, a hat pinned carefully to gray hair pulled back in a manner that suggested discipline, pride, survival. Her purse hung from the crook of her arm as she navigated the broken sidewalk with the careful steps of someone who had learned to move through a world that was not designed for her comfort. The officer stepped out from between two parked cars. He was young, Irish, new to the Harlem beat. His uniform still crisp in a way that marked him as someone who hadn't yet learned what kind of neighborhood he was working. Or perhaps he had learned, and that was the problem. Perhaps he had learned the particular cruelty that a badge could afford a white man in a black neighborhood in 1934. Perhaps he had watched the older cops and understood that here, in these blocks north of 110th Street, the law was whatever they decided it would be on any given afternoon. The confrontation began over nothing, a sidewalk dispute. She had not moved quickly enough when he approached. Or perhaps she had not moved at all, because why should she? The sidewalk belonged to everyone. But belonging is a complicated word, and in Harlem in 1934, belonging was always conditional, always subject to revision by anyone wearing a badge. The words exchanged were brief. Her voice, witnesses would later recall, never rose above the firm, measured tone of a woman who had raised children through the Depression, who had buried a husband, who had survived the South before coming north to discover that freedom was just another word that meant different things depending on who was saying it. His voice rose. Threats about respect, about knowing one's place, about teaching lessons. The ugly language of power meeting dignity and choosing violence. Then his hand moved. The slap caught her full across the face, hard enough to knock her hat sideways, hard enough to send her stumbling against a storefront window. Hard enough that the white gloves, symbols of her propriety, her self-respect, her defiance against a world that wanted to strip her of both, fell to the dirty sidewalk. And the street stopped breathing. Not because violence was unusual in Harlem. Violence visited these blocks every day, wearing uniforms and plainclothes, carrying badges and blackjacks. But this was different. This was a mother. This was someone's grandmother. This was a woman who wore white gloves to church on Tuesday afternoons, who represented something that even the worst elements of Harlem understood was sacred. The officer seemed to recognize his mistake immediately. Not a moral recognition. Nothing in his face suggested remorse, but a practical understanding that the silence was wrong, that the crowd gathering at a distance was wrong, that something in the temperature of the afternoon had shifted in a way that his training had not prepared him for. He left quickly, his pace just short of running. his hand resting on his service revolver in a way that suggested he suddenly felt less safe than he had 5 minutes earlier. The woman straightened her hat, picked up her gloves, accepted the steadying hand of a store owner who had emerged from his shop. Her face betrayed nothing, no tears, no rage, just that same firm dignity that had preceded the slap and would outlast the shame the officer had tried to inflict. But as she walked away, someone in the crowd whispered a name, and the whisper moved through the street like electricity through water, carried from corner to corner, from stoop to speakeasy, from the numbers joints to the social clubs. The name reached the person it needed to reach within the hour. And Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson said nothing at all. The silence that followed would last 72 hours. But when it ended, everyone in Harlem would understand that some things, some people, some principles, some lines were not negotiable. Not with anyone, not even with a badge. The world that made the moment possible. To understand what happened in those 72 hours, you have to understand Harlem in the 1930s. Not the Harlem of postcards and jazz tourism, not the Harlem Renaissance that white newspapers occasionally acknowledged when it was convenient or exotic enough to sell papers. But the Harlem where real people lived real lives, under conditions that were designed deliberately and systematically to remind them every single day that America had not been built for their benefit. This was a Harlem that existed in the shadow of abandonment. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of Black Americans north, searching for the promise of something better than Jim Crow and lynch mobs and sharecropping that was slavery by another name. They arrived in New York and discovered that the North had its own systems, its own ways of making sure that freedom remained theoretical, that opportunity remained just out of reach, that dignity was something you had to fight for every single morning. The police in Harlem were not peacekeepers. They were an occupying force. They did not live in the neighborhood they patrolled. They did not know the families behind the doors they kicked in. They did not attend the churches or shop at the markets or send their children to the schools. They arrived each day like soldiers entering hostile territory, and they treated the residents accordingly, with suspicion at best, with contempt more often, with violence whenever they felt it was warranted. Which was often. Corruption was not an aberration, it was the system. Officers collected payments from numbers runners and bootleggers and brothel owners. They shook down legitimate businesses for protection money. They took bribes to look the other way, and they took bribes to not look the other way. The badge was a license to extract wealth from a community that had very little to give, and the uniform was a shield against any consequences. And if someone objected, if someone dared to challenge an officer, to talk back, to assert their rights as citizens, the response was swift and brutal. Beatings in alleyways, arrests on fabricated charges, nights in precinct basements where questions were asked with fists and boots and telephone books that left no marks. The law did not protect Black Harlemites from the police. The law was whatever the police said it was, and there was no appeal, no recourse, no justice that did not come with a cost too high for most people to pay. This created a particular kind of silence, not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of survival. People learned to lower their eyes, to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to swallow their anger and their dignity because the alternative was a hospital bed or a jail cell or worse. They learned that a badge was more dangerous than any street criminal, because at least the criminals lived by codes that made sense, by rules that everyone understood. The police operated in a space beyond rules, beyond accountability, answerable to no one except other officers who shared their contempt for the neighborhood they were supposed to serve. In this environment, reputation became currency. Power became protection. And the men who could offer that protection, who could provide some measure of safety in a world designed to be unsafe, those men became more than criminals. They became necessary. They became community leaders by default, filling a vacuum that the legitimate power structure had created through its own cruelty and indifference. This was the world that created men like Bumpy Johnson. And this was the world where a slap could mean something far more dangerous than a simple act of violence. The man they whispered about. The story of Ellsworth Raymond Johnson does not begin with power. It begins with displacement, with violence, with the particular kind of rage that comes from growing up in a society that makes very clear that your life has less value than others. He was born in South Carolina in 1905, the son of a father who worked himself into an early grave, and a mother who understood that the South was a trap that would swallow her children if she did not move them north. Margaret Johnson made that move when Bumpy was still a boy, bringing her family to Harlem in search of the promise that so many others were chasing, the promise that proved both real and false, delivered and broken, depending on which day you asked and who was answering. Young Bumpy was brilliant. Teachers recognized it immediately. He consumed books the way other children consumed candy. History, philosophy, literature. He read everything he could find, building an education in the Harlem Public Library that would later make him one of the most intellectually formidable figures in organized crime. But brilliance does not protect black boys in America. It does not shield them from the violence of poverty or the cruelty of a system that sees them as threats before it sees them as children. He fell into street life the way water finds cracks in concrete, inevitably following the path of least resistance towards something that felt like respect, like power, like control in a life that offered very little of any of those things. Minor crimes at first, then bigger ones. By his teens, he was running with the older boys, learning the rhythms of Harlem's underground economy, understanding how money moved through the neighborhood in ways that had nothing to do with banks or legitimate businesses. He went to prison young, served time in some of the worst facilities in the state system. But prison, for Bumpy, became another kind of school. He read even more voraciously, studied human nature in an environment where misreading someone's intentions could cost you your life, learned that violence was a tool, not a solution, that fear properly deployed was more effective than force, that power came not from the loudest voice or the biggest fist, but from calculation, from patience, from understanding what people wanted and what they feared and how to use both. When he emerged, he was someone different. Not reformed, he had no intention of going legitimate in a society that offered black men so few legitimate paths to success. But refined, disciplined, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with intelligence. He entered the numbers racket at a time when Harlem's underground economy was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The numbers game, an illegal lottery that allowed poor people to gamble pennies on 3-digit combinations, was generating millions of dollars. And white organized crime, represented by figures like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, was looking to take over what had been a primarily black operation. Bumpy became essential in this transition. Not as hired muscle, but as someone who understood both worlds. He could speak the language of the Italian mobs and the Jewish syndicates. But he also understood Harlem, understood the community, understood how to operate in the neighborhood without turning the residents against him. He became a bridge, and bridges are valuable. They are also vulnerable. So he made himself more than valuable. He made himself necessary. And he did it through a combination of intelligence, discipline, and a reputation for handling problems with a precision that bordered on surgical. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He rarely even raised his voice. But when Bumpy Johnson said something would be handled, it was handled. When he made a promise, it was kept. When he drew a line, that line became absolute. People in Harlem learned that his word was his bond, and that violating that bond came with consequences that were both certain and devastating. But there was something else about Bumpy Johnson that made him different from the other operators in Harlem's underworld. He had a code. Not the romantic code of Hollywood gangsters, but a practical set of principles that governed his behavior and created boundaries that even his enemies understood he would not cross. He did not tolerate drugs in his operations. He did not allow violence against women. He did not permit his people to prey on the weakest members of the community, the elderly, the children, the desperate. And above all, he did not allow disrespect toward mothers. Not his mother specifically, though she occupied a place of reverence in his life that bordered on sacred. But all mothers, all women of that generation who had survived the South, who had raised families through impossible circumstances, who represented a link to dignity and tradition and survival that even the criminal world of Harlem understood was worth protecting. This was not sentimentality. It was strategy. Bumpy understood that in a community that had been stripped of so much, of wealth, of opportunity, of justice, symbols mattered. Mothers were symbols. They represented continuity, morality, the possibility that the next generation might have something better. To violate that symbol was to attack something fundamental. It was to declare that nothing was sacred, that no line existed, that chaos could reign without consequence. So when word reached Bumpy Johnson that a police officer had slapped his mother in the middle of Lenox Avenue in broad daylight, the calculation that followed was not about revenge. It was about order, about boundaries, about sending a message that would resonate far beyond one man's humiliation. And the message would be delivered not with rage, but with the cold precision that had made Bumpy Johnson the most feared man in Harlem. Margaret Johnson had survived too much to be broken by a slap. She had been born in the aftermath of Reconstruction, in a South that was systematically dismantling every promise that emancipation had made. She had watched as Jim Crow laws codified the informal oppression of slavery into legal structures that would endure for generations. She had lived through the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs attacked black communities across the country with impunity. She had made the journey north with her children, believing the promise that things would be different in New York, that freedom meant something beyond geography. She had raised her son through poverty and violence, and the constant weight of a society that wanted black people to remain small, to remain quiet, to remain grateful for whatever scraps they were given. She had watched him fall into crime and felt the particular heartbreak of a mother who knows her child is brilliant, but lives in a world that offers brilliant black boys so few paths to use that brilliance legitimately. But through it all, she had maintained her dignity. Sunday church services, white gloves, the careful attention to appearance and comportment that marked her as a woman who refused to accept the degradation that society tried to impose. She represented a generation that had survived by maintaining standards, by holding onto small rituals of respectability even when the world around them insisted they deserved no respect. When the officer struck her, he was not just hitting an elderly black woman. He was striking at something larger, at the idea that dignity could exist in Harlem, that respect could be demanded rather than begged for, that a black woman in her 60s could walk down a public street in white gloves and expect to be treated as anything other than invisible or contemptible. The crowd that witnessed the slap understood this immediately. That was why the silence was so complete. Everyone watching knew that something fundamental had been violated. Not just the law was violated every day in Harlem, and no one came to restore order. But something deeper, a code that transcended criminal and civilian, that existed in the unspoken understanding of what held a community together when every official institution was working to tear it apart. Margaret Johnson went home. She did not cry. She did not rage. She applied a cold compress to her face and went about her afternoon as if nothing had happened. Because acknowledging the pain would be giving the officer something he did not deserve. Proof that he had affected her, that his violence had achieved its goal of diminishment. But her son noticed the swelling. He noticed the way she moved more carefully, the way she held herself with even more rigid dignity than usual, the way her eyes contained something that looked like resignation. Not to the slap itself, but to the knowledge that this was the world her children and grandchildren would continue to inhabit, where a badge could mean anything and justice was a word without practical meaning. She told him what had happened, the facts only, delivered in the same measured tone she used to discuss the weather or the price of groceries. She did not ask him to do anything. She knew what he was, what he did. And she had long ago made peace with the fact that her son had chosen a path she could not approve of, but could not prevent. Bumpy listened, asked questions. Where exactly, what time, what the officer looked like, what was said. His voice remained calm throughout. He kissed his mother's forehead when she finished the story, told her to rest, told her not to worry. Then he walked out of her apartment and into the summer heat of Harlem, and the calculations began. In the criminal world, reputation is everything. It determines who respects you, who fears you, who will work with you, who will betray you. And reputation is built not just through action, but through restraint. Through the ability to absorb provocation without immediately reacting. Through the discipline to wait for the right moment, to gather information, to respond in ways that maximize impact while minimizing risk. Bumpy Johnson had built his reputation on this principle. While other operators in Harlem were loud, flashy, quick to violence, Bumpy moved differently. He spoke quietly. He thought before he acted. He treated confrontations like chess matches, always thinking several moves ahead, always considering consequences and counter moves, always ensuring that when he did act, the action would be so precisely calibrated that no one would miss the message. So when news of the slap spread through Harlem, and it spread immediately, carried from corner to corner by the informal communication network that connected the neighborhood more efficiently than any telephone system, people waited to see how Bumpy would respond. Would he explode into rage? Would he hunt down the officer immediately and deliver street justice in front of witnesses? Would he use his connections to file a complaint, knowing it would go nowhere but wanting to go through official channels anyway? He did none of these things. He went about his day as if nothing had happened. He made his usual rounds, collected money from his operations, met with his associates, discussed business with the same calm efficiency that characterized all his interactions. He ate dinner. He read for several hours, as was his habit, philosophy that night. Marcus Aurelius on discipline and self-control. He went to bed at his usual time, and the absence of reaction terrified Harlem more than any explosion of violence would have. Because people understood what Bumpy's silence meant. It meant he was thinking. It meant he was planning. It meant that whatever response was coming would not be impulsive or sloppy or easy to predict. It meant that somewhere, somehow, the officer who had slapped Margaret Johnson had started a clock, and when that clock ran out, the consequences would be measured and unavoidable. The officer, whose name circulated through the neighborhood within hours, seemed to understand this at some level. He changed his patrol route, started walking with a partner, checked over his shoulder with increasing frequency. The bravado that had allowed him to strike an elderly woman in broad daylight began to erode, replaced by a nervousness that everyone noticed but no one commented on directly. Bumpy spent the first day after the incident simply gathering information, not through intimidation or violence, but through the network of eyes and ears that every successful operator in Harlem maintained. Who was this officer? Where did he live? What were his habits, his weaknesses, his fears? What were his routines? Did he have family? Did he have debts? Did he have secrets? The information came back in pieces, assembled like a puzzle by people who understood that Bumpy Johnson's interest in someone was not casual, that the questions meant something, that providing accurate information was both an obligation and a form of protection. Because being known to help Bumpy was safer than being suspected of hindering him. By the end of the first day, Bumpy knew everything relevant about the officer. His apartment in the Bronx, his drinking habits, his gambling debts, his reputation among other cops as someone whose temper was becoming a problem. His history of complaints from Harlem residents that had been dismissed or buried. The fact that he was engaged to be married in 3 months. The second day, Bumpy began applying pressure. Not direct pressure. He never approached the officer, never sent anyone to threaten him, never did anything that could be traced back as intimidation. But strange things started happening in the officer's life. Small things, unsettling things. His car, parked on his street in the Bronx, was found with all 4 tires flat. Not slashed, just deflated, as if someone wanted to inconvenience him without committing obvious vandalism. His mail went missing for 2 days. His regular bar stool at his favorite pub was occupied every night that week by strangers who looked at him with knowing expressions, but said nothing. Someone sent a letter to his fiancée. The letter contained no threats, no accusations, just a newspaper clipping about police corruption in Harlem, with a single sentence written in careful handwriting at the bottom. Ask him about Tuesday afternoon on Lenox Avenue. These were not random incidents. They were moves in a larger game designed to create a sense of being watched, of being vulnerable, of having crossed a line that extended far beyond the moment of the slap. The officer felt his world shrinking, felt the certainty of his protection beginning to crumble. He was learning what Margaret Johnson had known her entire life, that safety is an illusion, that power can evaporate, that the structures meant to protect you can fail at any moment. On the third day, the officer did not show up for his shift. His partner knocked on his apartment door and received no answer. His fiancée had not heard from him. His parents, called as a last resort, said they had not seen him in weeks. The search that followed was perfunctory. Missing persons cases involving adults were rarely pursued with urgency. And a cop who had gambling debts and a reputation for drinking was someone his fellow officers assumed had simply taken off, might for a few days to clear his head or avoid a problem. He reappeared 72 hours after the slap, almost to the hour. A patrol car found him at dawn, wandering through Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. He was naked except for his underwear. His skin was unmarked, no bruises, no cuts, no signs of physical trauma. But his mind had come undone. He was speaking, but not coherently. The same phrases repeated over and over. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Tell her I'm sorry. Respect mothers. I'm sorry. Respect mothers. His eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around as if seeing things that were not there. When other officers tried to calm him, to get him to explain what had happened, he became increasingly agitated, backing away from them, covering his face, mumbling about shadows and silence and watching. There was no evidence of drugs in his system, no alcohol, no explanation for the psychological break except trauma of a kind that left no visible marks. The only other detail, noticed by the officers who found him, was a small piece of paper pinned to his undershirt. The message, written in the same careful handwriting that had appeared on the letter to his fiancée, contained just 3 words: "Respect your mothers." What happened to that officer during those 72 hours remains a subject of speculation in Harlem to this day. The story exists in the space between documented fact and community legend, told and retold with variations that shift depending on who is telling and who is listening. But certain elements remain consistent across every version. No one ever saw Bumpy Johnson near the officer. No witnesses placed any of Bumpy's known associates at the scene of his disappearance. The investigation, such as it was, found no evidence of kidnapping, no ransom demand, no clear crime that could be prosecuted. But people in Harlem understood what had happened, even if they could not prove it. They understood because they knew how Bumpy operated. They knew that his power came not from visible displays of force, but from the ability to make people understand, viscerally, psychologically, that crossing certain lines meant entering a space where normal rules no longer applied, where protection evaporated, where consequences arrived with mathematical certainty. The legend suggests that Bumpy orchestrated an experience designed not to harm the officer's body, but to dismantle his sense of safety and control. That he was taken somewhere isolated. That he was kept in darkness, or perhaps in light so constant it became its own form of darkness. That he was not beaten, but subjected to the particular kind of psychological pressure that breaks something deeper than bones. Some versions of the story say he was made to witness what he had done. Bester shown footage or photographs of the slap from angles he did not know existed, forced to confront his own capacity for casual cruelty. Others say he was simply isolated and ignored, left in silence with only his own thoughts and the growing certainty that whatever came next would be worse than anything he could imagine. Some say he was visited by people who never touched him, but made clear, through their presence and their silence, that his life continued only because they were allowing it to continue. That this permission could be revoked at any moment. That no badge, no union, no police department could reach into the space where he now existed and pull him back to safety. The truth, whatever it was, left him psychologically shattered in a way that no physical beating could have accomplished. When he was released, returned to the park like a message being delivered, he was a warning to every other officer who might think that power was absolute, that a badge meant immunity, that the people of Harlem had no recourse except to accept whatever treatment was inflicted on them. The officer never worked another shift. He was quietly pushed toward early retirement, his psychological break attributed to stress and depression that had nothing to do with Harlem and everything to do with personal issues that the department had no obligation to investigate further. His engagement was broken off. He moved away from New York entirely, found work as a security guard in a small town where no one knew his history. But before he left, a few people managed to speak with him during his more lucid moments. They asked what had happened, where he had been, who had taken him. His answers were vague, contradictory, unhelpful to anyone looking for evidence. But one phrase appeared consistently. He never touched me. No one touched me. But they made me understand. Understand what? That some things are sacred, that respect is not negotiable, that there are consequences that have nothing to do with the law. The story spread through Harlem with the force of mythology meeting necessity. In barbershops and churches, in speakeasies and numbers joints, in the quiet conversations on stoops and fire escapes, people told and retold what had happened. Each telling added details or stripped them away, but the core remained constant. An officer had crossed a line, and the line had been enforced with a precision that made everyone recalibrate their understanding of power in the neighborhood. Police behavior in Harlem did not change overnight. Corruption continued. Brutality continued. The systematic oppression that characterized law enforcement in black neighborhoods did not disappear because one officer had been made an example. But something shifted, subtle but noticeable. Officers who worked the Harlem beat became more careful about certain things. They still collected their payments and looked the other way when it suited them. But they thought twice before striking elderly women. They considered consequences before casual acts of humiliation, because now there was a question that had not existed before. Was this person connected? Was this grandmother someone's mother? Was this act of violence one that would disappear into the usual indifference? Or was this the kind of violation that would set in motion something far beyond the normal calculus of power and protection? The uncertainty itself became a form of order, not justice. Justice requires systems and accountability and consequences that are applied equally. But order, the understanding that even in a world where official justice did not function, where police operated with near impunity, there were still boundaries that existed through different means. This is what Bumpy Johnson understood better than almost anyone operating in Harlem's underworld. He understood that crime, in a community abandoned by legitimate systems, could serve a regulatory function, not a moral function. He was not Robin Hood, not some romantic figure stealing from the rich to give to the poor, but a practical function, enforcing norms that the official system refused to enforce, creating consequences where none existed, providing protection when police were the primary threat rather than the solution. His reputation grew not just as a criminal, but as a figure of order in a disordered world. People knew he ran numbers, knew he was involved in operations that were illegal and sometimes destructive. But they also knew that he kept more violent elements in check, that he prevented his operations from preying on the most vulnerable, that he enforced rules that even the police seemed to ignore. This made him valuable to the community in ways that complicated the normal categories of criminal and legitimate. He was both threat and protection, both problem and solution. He represented the failure of official systems to serve black communities, but he also represented those communities' ability to create their own structures of power and accountability when abandoned by those official systems. The story of what happened to the officer became part of Bumpy's legend. It joined other stories, some verified, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated, that created the mythos around him. Each story reinforced the same principles: that he was intelligent, that he was calculating, that he could not be intimidated, that crossing him meant consequences that arrived with certainty, even if the mechanism of those consequences remained mysterious. This legend served a purpose beyond ego. It allowed Bumpy to operate with less actual violence than his reputation suggested. Because people believed the stories, believed the mythology, they were less likely to test whether the reality matched the legend. The story of the slap and its aftermath prevented dozens, perhaps hundreds of similar confrontations. It made everyone more careful, more aware that actions had consequences that might not be immediate but would be unavoidable. For Margaret Johnson, the aftermath was more complicated. She had not asked her son to do anything. She had not wanted vengeance or consequences. She had simply wanted to go about her life with the dignity she had maintained through decades of far worse treatment than one slap. But she understood, as mothers in communities like Harlem understood, that her children lived in a different world than she did, that they fought back in ways her generation had not been able to fight, that the price of that fighting was moral complexity she could not always approve of, but could not entirely condemn. She continued her routines. Church on Sundays and Tuesdays, white gloves, the same careful attention to appearance and comportment. But people in the neighborhood treated her differently now. Not with pity, pity would have been insulting, but with a kind of reverence that acknowledged she had become a symbol of something larger than herself. She was proof that some violations would not be tolerated, that even in a neighborhood where official justice was a joke, there were still lines that would be enforced through other means. She never spoke publicly about what happened to the officer. When asked, she simply said that the Lord worked in mysterious ways and that people reap what they sow. The biblical language was deliberate, creating distance between the moral framework she lived within and the actions her son may or may not have taken. It allowed her to maintain her dignity, her faith, her sense of living according to principles, while acknowledging that the world her children inhabited required different responses to different threats. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson would go on to become one of the most significant figures in Harlem's criminal underworld for the next 3 decades. His partnership with Lucky Luciano and other Italian mobsters helped shape organized crime in New York City. His intelligence and discipline made him invaluable as a bridge between white criminal enterprises and black neighborhoods that those enterprises wanted to exploit, but could not navigate without someone like Bumpy. He would be arrested multiple times, serve prison sentences, survive assassination attempts, and maintain his position through decades of upheaval in both the criminal world and Harlem itself. But the story that people remember most clearly is not the million-dollar operations or the high-level meetings with mob bosses. It's the story of a slap and silence and 72 hours that became legend. The story endures because it captures something essential about how power operates in communities that have been abandoned by official systems. It illustrates that reputation can be more effective than force, that psychological dominance can achieve more than physical violence, that the threat of consequences can be more powerful than the consequences themselves. It endures because it speaks to a particular experience of black communities in America. The understanding that official justice would not protect them, that police were often the perpetrators rather than the preventers of violence, that survival required creating alternative structures of accountability and consequence. And it endures because, unlike so many stories of criminal violence, this one contained a moral clarity that resonated across criminal and civilian lines. The officer had violated something fundamental. What happened to him, whatever actually happened, was understood as proportionate in a way that made sense to people who lived in a world where disproportion was the norm, where black lives were treated as less valuable, where dignity was something you had to fight for every single day. The legend became a teaching tool. Parents in Harlem told their children a version of the story as a way to explain respect, consequences, and the importance of treating elders with dignity. Criminal operators told the story as an illustration of how power should be exercised, with precision rather than abandon, with calculation rather than rage. Police officers who worked Harlem heard the story and understood it as a warning that power has limits, that badges do not provide absolute protection, that certain violations would generate responses that transcended the normal rules of engagement between law enforcement and community. Whether the story unfolded exactly as the legend suggests is, in some ways, less important than what the story represents. Legends survive not because they are necessarily true in every detail, but because they express truths that communities need to preserve. The legend of Bumpy Johnson and the slap expressed something that Harlem needed to believe: that they were not powerless, that violations could be answered, that respect could be enforced, even when official systems refused to provide justice. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, collapsing in a restaurant in Harlem from a heart attack. His funeral drew thousands of people, criminals and civilians, people who worked with him and people who feared him, people who approved of his methods and people who condemned them but respected what he represented. The streets of Harlem were lined with residents who came to pay respects to a man who had been, in his own complicated way, a protector of their community. The stories told at that funeral, and in the years since, return again and again to the same themes: intelligence over force, patience over rage, consequences delivered with precision, the understanding that power exercised thoughtfully is more effective and more enduring than power exercised carelessly. And always, the story of the slap, of an elderly woman in white gloves, of silence that lasted 72 hours, of an officer who reappeared broken by something that left no physical marks, of a message delivered with mathematical certainty that some things, some people, some principles were sacred. In the decades since Bumpy Johnson's death, Harlem has transformed in ways he would barely recognize. The neighborhood has gentrified. Police practices have evolved, though the fundamental tensions between law enforcement and black communities remain unresolved. The criminal underworld he helped build has continued 1.44 p.m. shifted and fragmented. The numbers racket that generated so much money in his era has been replaced by state-run lotteries that generate far more revenue without the protections Bumpy provided to the community. But the stories remain. They're told by grandparents to grandchildren, by historians documenting the complicated history of black organized crime, by filmmakers and writers trying to capture something essential about power and community and survival in America. They're told with variations and embellishments, with details added and removed, with moral frameworks applied and questioned. The story of the slap has been adapted into films and television shows, books and documentaries. Each version emphasizes different aspects. Some focus on the violence, some on the injustice, some on the relationship between mother and son. But they all return to the core: that respect matters, that violations generate consequences, that silence can be more terrifying than noise. What makes this particular story resonate beyond the specifics of Harlem in the 1930s is that it addresses something universal about dignity and power. Everyone understands what it means to be humiliated. Everyone understands the desire for consequences when someone violates a fundamental boundary. Everyone understands the appeal of a figure who can enforce consequences when official systems fail to do so. But the story also contains a warning. Because power exercised outside official systems, no matter how justified it may seem in specific instances, remains dangerous. It relies on individual judgment rather than collective agreement. It operates without transparency or accountability. It can be deployed justly in one case and unjustly in another. Depending on who wields it and what they decide, constitutes a violation. Bumpy Johnson was, by all accounts, more restrained and more principled than many who operated in his world. His code, protection for women and children, no drugs, respect for elders, created boundaries that made his power less destructive than it might have been. But he was still a criminal. His operations still caused harm. His methods, however measured, still involved violence and intimidation. The fact that he filled a vacuum created by the failure of official systems does not erase the complications of how he filled that vacuum. This is the tension that makes his story compelling rather than simply celebratory. He represents both the failure of legitimate systems to serve Black communities and the problematic solutions that arise when those systems fail. He is a symptom and a response, a problem and a protection, depending on which angle you examine him from. The story of the slap captures this tension perfectly. It is simultaneously a story about justice being served and about justice being perverted, about power being used to protect the vulnerable and about power being used to terrify, about consequences being proportionate and about consequences operating outside any framework that could determine proportionality. What we choose to emphasize when we tell the story reveals what we believe about power, about justice, about community, about survival. Some versions treat Bumpy as a hero, delivering righteous consequences to a corrupt officer who deserved everything he received. Other versions treat him as a cautionary tale about what happens when communities are forced to rely on criminal elements for protection. Both versions contain truth. Neither captures the full complexity. The real lesson of the story may be this: that silence can be more powerful than words, that patience can be more effective than rage, that reputation built carefully over time can achieve more than force applied carelessly in the moment. These lessons transcend crime and legitimacy. They apply to anyone trying to navigate a world where power is distributed unequally, where official systems fail to provide justice, where survival requires creating alternative structures of consequence and accountability. Bumpy Johnson understood this. He built his power not through constant displays of violence, but through the careful cultivation of a reputation that made violence unnecessary most of the time. He understood that every action sent a message, that messages accumulated into mythology, that mythology could govern behavior more effectively than constant enforcement. The story of what happened to the officer who slapped Margaret Johnson is that mythology distilled to its essence. It contains everything that made Bumpy Johnson feared and respected: intelligence, patience, precision, an understanding of psychology, and above all, the message that certain lines existed and would be enforced regardless of who tried to cross them. Whether the story unfolded exactly as the legend suggests, we will never know with certainty. No official records document what happened during those 72 hours. No court case was ever filed. No investigation produced evidence of kidnapping or assault. The officer's psychological break was attributed to personal issues that had nothing to do with Harlem or Bumpy Johnson, or any consequences for actions taken on a Tuesday afternoon in July. But Harlem knew. The knowledge spread through the community like water finding its level, settling into the collective understanding of how power operated in their neighborhood. The knowledge was reinforced every time someone told the story, every time an officer hesitated before acting, every time someone walking down Lenox Avenue felt a little safer because they understood that violations would not always go unanswered. The story survives because communities need stories like this. They need to believe that the powerful are not invulnerable, that violations generate consequences, that respect can be enforced even when official systems refuse to provide it. They need to believe that silence can be strategic, that patience can be powerful, that discipline can defeat force. These needs do not make the story true in every detail, but they make it true in the way that legends are true, not as documentary fact, but as expressions of values, warnings about boundaries, illustrations of principles that communities want to preserve and pass down through generations. On a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1934, a police officer struck an elderly black woman on a Harlem street. The slap lasted a fraction of a second. The silence that followed lasted 72 hours. What happened in those 72 hours became legend. Not because of what could be proven, but because of what needed to be believed. That dignity matters, that mothers are sacred, that violations generate consequences, that respect is not negotiable. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson built an empire on these principles, not through constant violence, but through the careful deployment of reputation and the precise calibration of response. He understood that power exercised thoughtfully lasts longer than power exercised carelessly. That fear generated by uncertainty is more effective than fear generated by spectacle. That the threat of consequences can govern behavior more efficiently than the consequences themselves. The story survives because it teaches something that communities living under oppression need to learn. That silence can be strategic. That patience can be powerful. That intelligence defeats force. That some lines, drawn not by law but by collective understanding, remain absolute. Whether the officer who slapped Margaret Johnson spent those 72 hours in the hands of Bumpy's organization, or whether his psychological break came from other sources, has never been definitively established. But the legend serves a purpose regardless. It reminds everyone, civilian and criminal, powerless and powerful, that respect is not optional, that dignity must be defended, that certain violations will be answered, even when official systems refuse to provide justice. This is not a story about heroism. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who built wealth through illegal operations in a community that already had too little. But it is a story about what happens when communities are abandoned by legitimate systems, when police become occupying forces rather than protectors, when survival requires creating alternative structures of power and consequence. The legend of the slap and the 72 hours that followed will continue to be told as long as people need to believe that violations can be answered, that silence can be strategic, and that sometimes, in the absence of justice, there is still accountability. The officer learned this lesson at a cost that shattered his mind. Harlem learned it in a way that changed behavior without changing laws. And the story itself became a lesson that has outlasted everyone involved, surviving in the oral history of a community that understood perfectly what the silence meant, what the 72 hours represented, and why some boundaries, once crossed, demand consequences that transcend badges, laws, and official systems that were never designed to provide justice in the first place. Respect your mothers. The message, simple and absolute, carries weight that extends far beyond 3 words on a piece of paper. It represents a code that governed Bumpy Johnson's life and operations. A principle that communities recognized as sacred even when official systems treated it as negotiable. A boundary that, once established, remained enforced through reputation rather than constant violence. This is the power of silence, the mathematics of fear, the precision of consequences delivered with patience rather than rage. This is what made Bumpy Johnson one of the most feared figures in Harlem's history. Not because of what he did constantly, but because of what everyone knew he could do when lines were crossed. The story survives. The lesson endures. And somewhere in the telling, between legend and history, between fact and mythology, between what happened and what people needed to believe happened, the truth reveals itself. That power properly understood is restraint properly deployed, and that sometimes the most devastating response is the one that never needs to be explained. Only remembered, nuanced, If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on what it teaches about power, respect, and consequences. Subscribe for more explorations of history's most fascinating legends.